So you guys remember in one of the first videos that we did in the HTML section, I explained how the main difference between a div element and a span element, they're both generic. They're just used to apply specific rules, and they're not special elements like a header. And even the header doesn't apply a lot of rules just to the header because it's a header. But for instance, an A element does. It applies, a text color and an underline, etc. And so a div and a span and a header and a main and a section, they're all generic. They generally have the same rules applied by default, with the exception sometimes of block level and inline display. So what we can do, we can change block level elements to inline. And how we do that, so the H1 element is a block level. If I hover over it here, you're going to see it's full width, and if I change the height, it actually does it. It changes the height. So that's a very good way of determining if an item is block or inline. If it's block, it's going to be full width and you can define the height. If it's inline, you cannot define the height. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the H1 element here to be inline instead of block. And how we're going to do that, in my style sheet, I'm going to target it, open up the rule curly braces here, and there's a property that you can set for every single element. The property name is display. And as you can see by this pop-up, these are valid values for this display attribute. So by default, the H1 is a block, but we can change it to inline. So let's go ahead and change that. Save it and refresh, and what you're going to see is that here it is not full width, and if I change the height, it does not change it, because it is now in line. Now, there is also there's like a middle way here, so we can change it to inline block. If I save and refresh, what you're going to see is by default, it is only as wide as it has to be, but now you can add height to it as such. So inline blocks are only as wide as they have to be, but they can use a height. Block elements are full width and can use height, and inline elements are just like span elements, like text here. They're just as high as they have to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this now, which is the H3 element. I'm going to change that to inline block as well. And how we're going to do that is I'm going to put a comma here and put H3. Now in CSS, this means any element that is either an H1 or an H3 element, apply this rule to it. So it doesn't have to be both, it needs to be either or. So I'm going to hit save and refresh, and we're going to see that now they're on the same line. Now something to note with this is that the line height is going to become important, because it's not, if the line height is different, so for instance if the text sizes are different, it's going to stretch the entire line and it's going to change where the smallest element is placed. So what we can do there is we can add some margin, or we can change the line height, or we can even just change the height itself. So let's hard limit this to height is 20 pixels. Save it and refresh, and that still didn't do it. So let's set margin to 0 pixels. Save, refresh. Now you'll see that still they're not the correct spacing. So I'm going to set line height now, and this applies to text. It's for how high the line can be itself. So we're going to set this to 20 pixels. Save it, refresh, and that still didn't really align it. And it's because the baseline here. Now how we would do this if we wanted to is, and this is something that I did previously, but I didn't really explain it that well because it wasn't necessary at the time. We're going to make this float. So I'm going to erase all this, put it back to normal, and then in just the h1 element, I'm going to write float, and as you can see these values for it, I'm going to say left. What this means when I refresh is it's going to pull this to the left of all the content, and any content that can fit to the right of it will. Now, as you notice, there are some interesting things that will happen with this. The background, is still all the way over there because this element technically exists there, but the content of it will only begin whenever the right side of this ends. So I'm going to set margin left equal to 200 pixels. I think it needs to be a bit more, 260. There we go. And then padding, well, margin top, $50 pixels. Now, as you'll see, what happened there is the margin of this has caused the floating left element to go down as well. So with the margin, as I explained in the previous videos, the orange there is the margin. So you can set an overall margin. If we wanted all sides to be the same, we would set margin just to one value, let's say 10 pixels. And this would give it 10 pixels outside the element on all sides. But you can also add margin, you can override, say, one rule if you want, margin top. Let's set that to 20 pixels. What will happen now is the left, bottom, and right sides will have a margin of 10 pixels, and the top will have a margin of 20 pixels. And again, this means that the element will begin within the confines of that margin. So see the background of that element, the white background doesn't begin, it only fills the inside space. The margin is considered outside space. So this is good for spacing elements away from each other, but if you wanted to add more space between the element and the content within the element, what you're going to do is use padding. So I'm going to set this really big so you guys can see. It's 50 pixels. There we go. What happens now, as you can see with the green, is that the padding exists within the element while the margin exists outside of the element. And there are times when you want to use either or, and it might not be as obvious when you're first looking at it, but there are times when you might want to use padding instead of margin, and we will definitely get an opportunity to see that because we're actually going to be building a website, and padding and margin are two very, very important parts of a website to properly place elements.